Thanks everyone for joining. We're here today with James Anthony Wolfe, the New York-based founder of a new company, the DSR Foundation. Very excited to be here. Thank you, James, for participating. Empire Space goes pretty far back with James, so we're really excited to see this new venture and so this new work that he's begun on. I'm really excited to learn more about it today with all of you. So I think I'd like to start with James introducing the DSR Foundation, giving us a quick overview of the DSR Foundation, what the organization does.
Great, thanks. It's great to be here. I really appreciate it. One small correction, the nomenclature, it's not a company per se, it is a nonprofit organization. In fact, it is a multilateral institution for pooled space risk defense capital funded by GDP-weighted sovereign contributions and issuing space risk bonds. It's a capital market instrument that transfers space origin risk to willing investors, structured as parametric catastrophe bonds within a global governance framework. Institutional coordination is intended to span across copious ITU and national grid authorities. To that extent, this is a nascent concept and a project, if you will, and we are only at the beginning of this transformative journey. It began last year. It resulted from a panel I hosted on behalf of the National Space Society at the International Space Development Conference, the ISDC. The panel was on funding and financing planetary defense with respect to, in particular, asteroid redirection and asteroid mitigation missions. And the organization evolved from that work. We published a white paper around the theoretical financial instruments that could be developed, and the provisional patent was filed last year in later that year. To that extent, again, this is a nascent organization. However, you can learn more about the organization at www.dsrfund.org. Again, that is www.dsrfund.org, with the important caveat that we are also exploring a rebranding of the project with respect to the naming and the associated titling and logo, and likewise for trademark and IP purposes, in addition to the provisional patent that we're continuing to develop and expound upon. So with that, I believe I've created a sufficient foundation for us to get into the questions. I will, though, just briefly note some information on my background and why I'm here at all. My name is James Wolfe. I am a partner here at Greenspoon Martyr. I am a emerging technologies attorney, which means that I work with startup companies, early stage and middle market enterprises with respect to securities representation, corporate governance, and contract work. I regularly work with commercial aerospace companies. And in fact, myself, I was a space entrepreneur before I became a lawyer. And more recently, in fact, I am a co-founder recipient of the 2023 NASA Entrepreneurs Challenge Award and a NIAC Phase 1 in 2024 for a interstellar mission architecture design study. And that similarly involved a decentralized distributed swarm network that is the underlying technology in which the company had received the Entrepreneur's Challenge Award for. With that said, of course, the totality of the commercial space companies in my portfolio have received countless SBIRs and SITRs, and likewise are all aggressively developing out their TRLs and likewise to engage in market opportunities and go operational, if you will. Yes. So thank you again for being here. Looking forward to this conversation today.
Awesome. Thank you so much, James. I think one thing that I'd like to go back on the DSR Foundation. So I think you said this came out essentially a panel at ISDC last year, but obviously I think that there was a reason that you were on that panel in the first place. I imagine the origins for sort of your connection to this problem go back further than last year.
Yes.
So if you could talk a little bit about sort of, I guess, like what draws you to this problem, how long you've been sort of in this space and thinking about this, and obviously sort of in the context of you being in this problem and sort of in this space for some time, sort of like why now? Why is now the right time?
Great. Great questions. So in addressing each in turn, I'll begin by saying upfront that the hosting of the panel last year was, as you correctly noted, merely another milestone along this journey in trying to develop out an alternative financial structure to be able to finance companies in industries or in areas of operation that are traditionally difficult for investors to participate in or otherwise to create such an industry around, per se. For example, the three pillars in which the organization is focused are: one, orbital debris mitigation and removal, which is obviously historically it's been difficult to finance the development and the deployment of the technology in that sector because there's no corresponding investor return or immediate ROI or elsewise per se that you would otherwise find in an industry such as the launch industry or the satellite industry, where there's precedence around ROI and there's an easy and tangible value attributed to the development and deployment of those technologies. The second, I will say, the second vertical that's being addressed is asteroid redirection in planetary defense. Obviously, that was the impetus of the panel that catalyzed these discussions. And then third, it's solar flare infrastructure resiliency, both terrestrial and in space. And those three verticals are in a way unique because each industry, if you will, per se, that could address those removal and risk reduction metrics are inherently difficult to finance because of, again, this inherent friction that exists with respect to early stage and institutional investors alike, and the typical traditional ROI structures that they're familiar with. And further, I would like to note that this journey is continuing. And this year, I'm co-chairing the planetary defense track at ISDC in June, where we will further explore these issues and work towards identifying and deploying innovative and creative solutions, both with respect to the National Space Society as an organization itself, as well as in particular this organizational project that we are currently naming the Defense Security Resilience Foundation.
Awesome. Thank you. I think, I'm not sure if we got to it. Why now, I think, was the other part.
Yes, compounded question. So let's get back to that.
Thank you.
Why now? The technology is continuing to mature. Obviously, every day that goes by continues to aggregate the risk with respect to each of those verticals. And the issues themselves with respect to each vertical continue to expand with respect to the aggregated risk. So orbital debris continues to aggregate. With respect to planetary defense, we're continuing to identify and discover new potentially hazardous NEOs on an ongoing basis. And with respect to solar events, quite similarly, we're entering a new Carrington cycle, and we could expect the solar maximum by 2036. So the timelines, and coincidentally, right, Apophis and likewise, that there's multiple signals, if you will, that we should evaluate and address in considering the importance of the impact if one of these three areas of concern, if there is an event within one of these three areas of concern.
That makes sense. I would, although I'm not being interviewed, I would maybe add also, like, I feel like the continued use of space, and not just continued, but sort of growing use of space, right? We have many more objects in space today. And I would say terrestrially, we're a lot more dependent on what activities we're doing in space, right? So I feel like that, in addition to these risks growing, right, means that together it's actually an even greater risk. Like solar flares or orbital debris, if they're growing, but also we need space more than we did yesterday, right? It becomes even worse.
Right. Exactly. There is a continuing importance here, and the technology and the companies that are rising to meet these concerns are evolving, and the technologies that enable those companies are maturing at the same time. Now, I want to emphasize that there's three deadlines that are converging that make this window critical. As I mentioned, asteroid Apophis will cross closer to Earth than geostationary satellites in April 2029. That, I believe, will be a watershed moment when we understand and reflect upon the importance of planetary defense funding and planetary defense technologies. Similarly, the projected threshold for self-sustaining orbital debris cascades vis-a-vis the Kessler syndrome, or elsewise the Kessler cascade concerns, that approaches around 2030 as well. And as I also previously mentioned, it's solar cycle 26, which will reach its peak around 2036, and it could carry a Carrington class risk to an increasingly vulnerable global grid. And the convergence of all of those three deadlines means that an organization that functions similar to how the DSR Foundation has been created will need to exist, if not now, then similarly quite soon in the near future, to be able to appropriately fund and finance the technology that will need to be deployed in advance of those deadlines to be able to appropriately address those potential cataclysms. And further, I'd note that no such institution or finance or private market financing structure exists today, and it's ubiquitous across the private market institutions that these three areas of concern: orbital debris, risk mitigation, planetary defense, and solar flare infrastructure resiliency, are not investable. It's not investable in the same way that reusable launch companies are, to the extent that they're receiving private market investment, to the same extent that commercial low Earth orbital space stations and space station companies are receiving private capital financing and public market financing in some scenarios, and elsewise solar flare resiliency to national and global energy grid considerations. These are all critically missing private market financing. And historically, the companies that have been trying to develop and deploy their technologies in those markets are receiving, nearly universal adverse decisions when it relates to investor interest, because again, it's this mismatch in traditional ROI and traditional financing and fund structures with respect to venture capital and private market deployment.
Great, thank you. I think what you were saying about the three deadlines converging is super compelling, and I feel like that's one of like the big points to make, is sort of how for all three of these we are in like the next decade looking at some huge deadlines. And so I think this concept and the DSR Foundation seems like it is starting at a great time, sort of to go back to one of the earlier questions. So it's great to hear that. I had a different direction to go, and so I feel like we've been talking about the problem to some extent, but I would like to spend maybe a little bit more time on the solution that you're working on. I know you covered this at least initially in the introductions, but if you could speak maybe a bit more to sort of how you're approaching this problem, the solution you're putting in place. I would say, I feel like there's two sides to it, right? There's sort of the financial infrastructure and mechanisms that you're building out, but then there's sort of what those enable, like the technologies. And I feel like in many cases, the technologies that you'd be financing already exist today, right? So I think maybe if you could speak to sort of the full picture, the technologies that will have to be used, sort of like their level of maturity, and sort of how what you're doing enables this, brings these together, where you fit in, if that makes sense.
Right. Yes. So I'll break down this response into three sections. The first, I just want to describe the long-term vision that I had in terms of the foundation and what it can do and where I see it going in the future. And this evolved in part out of the panel that I moderated, and the discussions and the internal processes and analysis that we engaged in. The future vision is that someday in the near future, we will have a fleet of interceptors pre-positioned in cislunar orbit that will be able to identify potential planetary defense threats vis-a-vis asteroids and emergent phenomena, and to be able to react in near real time, as compared to this current response cycle where we discover a potentially hazardous asteroid, such as YR 2024, for example, and then we would have to design, develop, test, manufacture, and then launch in together with finding the necessary financing and connecting the cooperative international, sovereign, and geopolitical considerations together. we would then launch the mission. That could take 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 years, if it's even possible at all. The solution that I developed was that instead of trying to work within that system, we create a new paradigm. The paradigm being that we pre-position these interceptor assets and we continue to grow the interceptor asset fleet while stationing it in a cislunar orbit. And then we maintain it as infrastructure. And that infrastructure would then be collateralizable and would continue to fund the development. And that's with respect to planetary defense. And by the way, having a capability like that would also have enabled us to send prospectors and probes to 3I Atlas and no less other emergent phenomena. And to that extent, that would allow us the flexibility as a civilization to address not only the sun-facing Venus populations of Trojans and likewise, but the emergent neo-hazardous asteroids timely in such a way that we can best deploy interceptors and other assets to mitigate the potential risk of impact. We have the technology. DART was a great example, but we cannot deploy the same structure as DART if we identify a hazardous asteroid like YR 2024 with a 5, 12, 24-month window of intercept. It's physically not possible. Then it becomes an issue of mitigating on the ground with displacement of populations and likewise. It's foolish to think that within the existing paradigm that we are currently in, that we can develop an effective asteroid defense platform using the same structures that historically we've relied upon. There's no investor there's no investor paradigm that could supplant that, and there's no ROI to the investor class vis-a-vis the private markets and VCs and likewise in deflecting an asteroid, unless theoretically the asteroid is pointed at their headquarters or their warehouses or manufacturing facilities, right? There's no particular specific inherent ROI value in that. So trying to approach the problem as a nonprofit organization developing a resilience-linked space bond was that solution. And that's to the planetary defense consideration. Similarly, with orbital debris and orbital debris mitigation, we also are confronting the potential implications of a Kessler cascade, which would leave orbit uninhabitable, no less uninhabitable, but unreachable. And I don't think that the appreciation of that concern is reflected with the importance and gravitas that is due. And the companies that are operating in that space, from my personal experience representing the commercial space industry, has been experiencing extreme difficulty in being able to finance the necessary development, commercialization, and deployment of their technology in the orbital debris field or industry, if you will. And quite similarly, with respect to solar flare infrastructure resiliency, historically, we've seen the tremendous impacts of Carrington events. And that was before industrialization and per se the reliance as a global consideration on interconnected technologies on the energy grid and likewise. So that's the first part of the answer. The second part, I want to quickly address the funding gap with more clarity. The proven funding mechanisms exist for every comparable terrestrial risk, but none of them have been applied to space origin threats. The pattern is consistent across all three threat domains. The detection and response technology are funded and operational, but the financial mechanisms to deploy them at scale or to fund recovery when they fail do not exist. What I mean by that is that proven markets and mechanisms like cat bond markets, right? In 2025, the cat bond market was $25.6 billion. And there's a proven mechanism around that with annual premiums of $4.43 billion. There's no similar equivalent for space origin, for asteroid deflection bonds, for debris removal funds, or for grid hardening. And these proven mechanisms exist in every category, except for space origin threats. The gap is not insufficient funding, it's a total absence. And that was revelatory in our exploration of this issue. For example, the World Bank cat bonds, the market size for the World Bank cat bonds are at $4.8 billion. The satellite insurance industry is at $700 million in market size. FEMA disaster funding is at $3.4 billion, and global issuance of cat bonds are $25.6 billion. For asteroid impact coverage, it's zero. Debris removal funds, it's zero. Grid hardening, it's zero. Space origin risk bonds, zero. It doesn't exist yet. That's what we identified, and that is what we are building. And because we have the precedence of the catastrophe bond market, that provides us the compelling narrative to connect the problem to the solution. And by the way, the World Bank alone has executed 17 catastrophe bond transactions. They've established the precedent with multilateral development institutions that can access capital markets for disaster risk transfer. Those instruments cover earthquakes, hurricanes, tsunamis, and even pandemics. The structural gap that we've identified is not that space origin risks are uninsurable. It is that no institution has yet structured the instruments to insure them. And that goes to the solution we developed and the proprietary technology and the proprietary patent that we have filed around this solution. Because again, the risk profiles are well characterized and the trigger mechanisms are measurable. It's the investor appetite that we are connecting. We are essentially saying that the investor appetite for uncorrelated catastrophe risk is documented, and that as sure as it exists in these terrestrial markets, we believe that for space origin risks, it can be documented similarly, and we can bring this to market. And so what does that mean? It means that the proposed financial architecture consists of an interlocking financial instrument. Each instrument, each sub-instrument, if you will, has a direct precedent in multilateral finance or catastrophe risk markets, and that together they create a comprehensive architecture for funding the necessary detection, response, and recovery across all three threat domains. And taking that one step further with respect to fidelity, what we're proposing is a multilateral institution for pooled space risk defense capital. It uses GDP-weighted contributions from member nation funds, which coordinate response across all three threat domains. And this institutional model is drawing directly on the Global Environmental Facility, the GEF, and the Global Facility for Disaster Reduction and Recovery, the GFDRR. Both of those are proven frameworks for pooling sovereign capital against global shared risks. And we're going one step further by developing out and issuing a space risk bond, which is a capital market instrument structured for each threat profile. They transfer space origin risk to investors willing to bear it in exchange for a premium yield. The result, therefore, is private capital, which flows into planetary defense, for example, without relying on government appropriations alone and supplementing or exceeding what the private market has been historically and traditionally willing to bear, as validated by all of these technology companies that are struggling to find the financing and investment necessary to develop and commercialize and deploy these solutions to the three threat domains. And each bond employs a parametric trigger, which is measurable and uses objective criteria that activates payouts without the delay of traditional loss adjustment. Parametric triggers are standard in the cat bond market. Earthquake magnitude, for example, hurricane wind speed, and pandemic case counts all serve as precedent for the astronomical and engineering metrics proposed here. So the GDP at risk modeling uses, therefore, a pricing space risk bond system, which therefore requires a robust methodology for quantifying economic exposure across threat domains. This GDP at-risk model combines impact probability distributions with economic exposure data to generate expected loss curves, the same actuarial foundation used by the existing catastrophe bond market. So therefore, in each threat domain, the model then integrates impact probability, which is derived from neo-population models, orbital debris density projections, and solar cycle activity forecasts. Economic exposure, which is measured as GDP concentration in affected zones, such as ground impact corridors, part of our analysis under the YR 2024 modeling, which was the basis of that panel that I moderated, and we discussed these considerations. The satellite-dependent economic activity and grid-connected economic output, mitigation capacity, accounting for existing deflection, removal, and hardening capabilities across the three threat domains to reduce residual risk, and the temporal correlation, which I think is especially unique to this model because it models the interdependencies between the threat domains, solar systems, solar storms, degrading debris avoidance systems, for example. What happens in the next Carrington event with a solar flare that impacts or increases the threat analysis around the potential for a Kessler cascade, for example. By the way, in February of 2022, a geomagnetic storm destroyed 38 Starlink satellites, and that illustrates this last factor, that space weather events can directly exacerbate orbital debris risk. So we need to look at these three threat domains holistically, and the GDP at risk model accounts for these three cross-domain correlations, which then allows us to produce more accurate pricing than a single threat model alone. And that's part of our proprietary software analysis system, which is the back end of the space bond instrument that would be deployed through the DSR Foundation.
Awesome. Thank you, James. So it sounds like, I mean, the concept and the mechanisms seem extremely well thought out. It seems like it, at least for me, sort of listening in, it seems like the idea is extremely sound and hopefully actionable. I guess my question for you is essentially sort of like, where are you at today as far as implementing this approach? I know you said you have a patent filed, but I assume essentially you need to sort of get people to, for lack of maybe the right word, invest in these mechanisms, start pooling funds. So where is it all today? What does like the near term look like? Sort of how do you see people participating in the near future? Where do you want this to be in the next 1 to 2 years? That kind of thing.
Yes. So to answer that question, I again want to direct the viewers to our website, www.dsrfund.org. There we have downloadable resources, including the white paper as well as presentation decks, and there's contact information, and you can, and there's a sign in account portal. So we are building the back end for this system, and we have been building it very aggressively. We have created the necessary officer positions, and we've established our initial cohort, if you will, with respect to our membership. And we are actively now building out our advisory contingent frameworks, as well as engaging on the institutional partnerships. I have a very, very exciting announcement that is coming quite soon. I'm not sure if it will be ready in time for the pitch later this week on Saturday. I'm working as quickly as I can, given all of the necessary dynamics at play. However, certainly by the June ISDC conference and the planetary defense track that I am co-hosting, I look forward to be able to announce that, and that will, and we'll put out press releases, and we'll get some considerable traction around that being the first mission of the DSR Foundation, the first space mission, and so to that extent, stay tuned. To be able to answer the remainder of your questions necessarily entails a brief foray into some of the other issues we have not discussed yet, and primarily those being around the governance framework. Just so that for the benefit of everyone listening, for many years, I've been on the board of the United Nations Association with respect to the Southern District of New York in advocacy of the Sustainable Development Goals, the 2030 SDGs, as they're colloquially known, and bringing and developing technology to address those. That's in part where I sit as an emerging technologies attorney in this role of both discovering, identifying, and guiding these companies to market and commercializing their technologies, both from a regulatory and geopolitical standpoint, but also with respect to securities representation and capital formation, and likewise. But similarly, there is a governance framework that I wanted to just briefly touch upon. So rather than creating a new supranational body, the DSR governance framework that we've developed establishes coordination protocols between existing institutions with dedicated financial governance for a future DSR bank and bond programs. And the framework is built on 4 principles. One, it's scientific oversight. Independent scientific advisory panels will govern all threat assessments and funding triggers with published criteria and open methodology. And that's one way that the viewers can participate with respect to their own expertise in these 3 threat domains. Additionally, there's institutional compatibility, which integrates with existing international bodies such as COPUOS for space coordination, ITO for spectrum and orbital management, and the national grid authorities for terrestrial resilience. And to that point, I will also note that I am a board member of the National Space Society, and I'm embedded within the International Committee, and we have a strong relationship with international partners, as well as interested sovereigns, and likewise in our active participation in these international frameworks. And then additionally, the proportional representation considerations, decision-making authority that's weighted by exposure, contribution, and capability, and ensuring that both spacefaring and non-spacefaring nations have a meaningful voice in risk governance that goes to the international considerations at play. And then similarly, the transparency and accountability within this governance framework that we've developed with respect to fund allocation, risk modeling inputs, bond trigger conditions, and governance decisions. This is one of the most complex projects that I've ever developed, and that's saying that's saying a lot. For additional context, I'm not sure the viewership knows, but I co-founded the USAI Council 2 years ago with a principal AI architect at Microsoft, and I co-authored AI legislation for the state of California, the city of Berkeley, which recently passed. It's the Berkeley rule, and that was with a principal AI architect at Google. So I'm well versed in dealing with complex, nuanced, policy-related matters and building new precedents around frameworks that brings about progress in furtherance of the public good. And so to that extent, in closing, the governance structure component to that question, we are developing a strategic oversight council, technical advisory panels, the financial operations and institutional partnerships with respect to the bank treasury, bond issuance, capital deployment and reporting considerations, and the compliance and audit components. So we are looking to quickly and aggressively expand vis-a-vis the threat domain timelines, and we are looking for all interested contributors to what we believe is a very important and unique institution that functions in such a way that neither NASA nor a private company nor a multilateral institution such as Copious can do, and that can do alone.
Awesome. Thank you, James. That was super helpful. I did have sort of maybe not exactly on the topic we were just talking about, maybe on the one prior, and also sort of on what we talked about in the introduction. Obviously, you're based in New York. I know that there's a New York function as part of the DSR Foundation. If you could speak a bit to sort of how New York fits into this, and also why, like sort of, why it's in New York and sort of why it's doing what it's doing in New York. I think that would be really interesting for this audience, as this is part of Space Week New York.
Right. Well, again, I will reiterate that the institution is in its nascent inception and that we are continuing to grow and evolve, but we have identified that New York is obviously a nexus of critical importance for a multilateral institution that we are envisioning. No less the fact that the UN headquarters and the UN ecosystem of NGOs is here and locally situated, and that also New York is colloquially the financial center of the world with respect to access to markets and likewise. And additionally, its common close proximity to both Washington, D.C. as a policy center in the necessary considerations there, but also across the East Coast with respect to the academic institutions like Harvard and MIT, but also the Northeast Corridor with respect to operations and flight development roadmaps vis-a-vis Florida and the Space Coast. And I would be remiss if I did not also mention that I'm based in New York City, and that as a sophisticated transactional attorney in the fintech and emerging technology markets, that I wholeheartedly believe that the inertia and momentum around quickly scaling an organization in these three threat domains are best represented with with visibility in the New York markets.
Awesome. Thank you. I think that's super clear. And that also fits into a lot of the themes that we think and talk about when we talk about sort of what makes New York strong in the space ecosystem. We have like about 10 minutes left here. I guess I have maybe one more question. I want to make sure there's time for audience Q&A. So I'd like to just sort of ask very broadly, like sort of, what are you looking for, like sort of like a community ask, if there's any kinds of collaborations, introductions, partnerships, people that you want to be more involved with, things that you need to help, anything that you're able to sort of put out there for people to give back. What are you looking for? I think is broadly the question.
Collaboration and participation. That is what is going to allow us to execute on this vision. It's going to take more effort than any of us and all of us combined to really bring this to market and to be able to make this happen. And we are actively looking for that interest. If you are at all moved by these threat domains, these 3 threat domains, and you have an expertise or specialty and you are interested in participating, we would like to talk to you. Please reach out to us on the website. Again, www.dsrfund.org. Our 3-year implementation roadmap on the website describes in further detail, but I will just briefly reference the goal. So we're in 2026. In 2027, we hope to initialize phase 1 with a pilot catastrophe bond. That's the first space origin risk bond issuance. It establishes market precedents and investor confidence for parametric triggers tied to asteroid deflection timelines. And also in parallel, the pilot programs around the other 2 threat domains similarly. In 2028, our goal is to initialize a debris removal escrow for operational. It's an operational escrow fund for active debris removal with pre-positioned capital, which it will enable rapid deployment contracts with commercial removal operators. And then in 2029, our goal is to launch the Planetary Defense Fund with full DSR bank operationality before Apophis's closest approach. The 3 funding windows active across all threat domains. And again, that goes to this very exciting news that we're working on, which I believe is a game changer, and it's going to receive significant national traction. This 3-year window we've identified, again, represents this rare convergence of scientific attention, public awareness, and capital market readiness. And the financial architecture must be operational before the next attention window forces improvisation by other organizations or multilateral institutions. This is the solution. We believe that this is the solution, and we are working to execute on this and to bring it into reality. And to that extent, again, if this interests you, if you believe that you can help make a difference, we would like to hear from you, because we believe this structure can change the world.
Awesome. It's super exciting, James. I want to see if there's any questions from the audience. If you have a question, feel free to raise your hand or write it in the chat. We could answer it here. If not, obviously, you can always reach James and the DSR Foundation at their website, dsrfund.org. Or if you have questions for me, although this is not about me or Empire Space, you know where to find us as well. So yeah, feel free to raise your hand, write questions in the chat. If not, then we'll wrap it up. I'll give like 1 minute for questions. In that time, I will say my concluding remarks, and then we can, if someone thinks of a question, we can always end with Q&A. So I'll just say, I think Quadri put in the chat the link to James's website, dsrfund.org. So if you want to copy that, now would be a good time. And then the other thing to say is that, in addition to reaching them on their website, James will also be around throughout Space Week. He'll be pitching the DSR Foundation at the closing townhouse party on Saturday. So if you want to sort of see him present more on that, please attend that closing party. Or just, connect with him, find time to meet him during the week or outside the week. James is in New York City, so for those that are in New York, he's pretty accessible. So yeah, unless there's any last questions, we can close it up right now. I don't know, James, if you want to say closing words.
Yes. Again, thank you. I really appreciate it. I very much respect the work that Empire Space is doing to bring together the New York space ecosystem, and I very much support it. In closing, I just want to elaborate on one last point that I briefly raised about the attention window. In April of 2029, asteroid Apophis will pass closer to Earth than our geostationary communication satellites. And for a brief moment, the entire world will be thinking about planetary defense. This organization's mission is to have the financial architecture and the solution to the development and commercialization and deployment for that planetary defense network ready by that moment. And for that brief moment, with the global attention, quite similarly, the entirety of space development, both sovereign and commercial, will be highlighted for the world. And we're continuing to see year by year more investment, more interest in commercial space and space development. And the paradigm, the paradigm going forward with respect to appreciating the importance of space development and space infrastructure and space technologies is continuing to grow. And by the time we reach that inflection point in 2029, when we have space-based solar energy satellites, space data orbital infrastructure, when we have heavy launch capabilities with commercial LEO stations, and all of the future that the entirety of the space development ecosystem is working towards, I think that the passing of Apophis will crystallize the global zeitgeist and the around the future, looking forward into the 2030s. And I believe it'll be a watershed moment, that it will catalyze the interest, the dynamics of the population, and it will serve as a, I don't want to say limiting function, but it will serve as a portal into pre-Apophis and post-Apophis. And when we look at what is on the other side of that transit with the global attention, I think that dramatically the perception of the public and the sovereigns and the governance institutions will be fundamentally different in that world, that we will see in whatever institution or framework it takes, we'll see an equivalent NASA or an equivalency of NASA and a budget around that, which is significant, will be significantly different in comparison to what we're currently looking at. And also the development of long-term, large-scale, global space development infrastructure projects, especially with respect to lunar development. And with that, I'd just like to say again, thank you, Evan. Thank you, Empire Space. And to the viewers out there, if you're interested by this and if you believe in the importance of this as we do, please reach out to us, because the success of this project, the success of this organization depends on you. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, James. Thanks everyone for joining us. Please come to the other events throughout the week, virtual and in person. Looking forward to seeing you all soon.